Hello and welcome to Political Geekery, a podcast about politics, science and the intersection of the two. Today is the 24th of June 2015. I'm Sean.
And I'm Mark. Hello. Okay, so today I wanted to cover a bit on the EU and if we are actually better off with them or without them. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is simply because I'm sick of one-sided media always portraying the negative. Got a funny feeling a lot of this has come from UKIP-style thinking, which hasn't really stopped, you know. I mean, I think Nigel Farage, his face is just like continuously on the BBC. They seem to just like following him around more than anyone else.
He does always have a very interesting pint.
And a cigarette. And a coat.
Yeah. Just like us.
You noticed his sidekick, possibly the guy that might be taking over from him, started copying the same sort of style.
Is that Nuttall? Or
I think so.
That baldy fella from Bootle?
I just noticed there's a sidekick that looks a bit similar to him. I don't pay them that much attention.
Oh, is it the one that jumped ship from the Tories? I don't know.
Aren't they all?
Yeah. All these racists look alike to me.
Yeah. Anyway, quick question for you then, Sean. You know, because I like torturing you with these things. How much of our exports do you think go to the EU?
I'm going to say 60%.
It's a bit lower than that. It's about 42%, of which we don't actually pay any taxes on because we're a member state. So we're financially better off in that way. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is immigration or expats, depending on your land. wonder why.
Depending on how white they are.
Yeah, depending on how white they are. Yeah. I find it funny that politicians are quite happy to bring in skilled workers and not pat them on the eyelid, but then when it comes to low skilled workers, it's the end of the world that they're coming in. And it seems to me that they want the skilled workers in because of the huge gaps within our own education system. I think people shouldn't be angry at immigrants or expats, if you prefer. They should be angry at more angry at the government for having an education system which isn't so good.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, one of the things that always gets me with this is that there's an implicit assumption in there that somehow it's better if a job goes to somebody who happened to be born in the UK as opposed to somebody who wasn't, and I don't see that at all. Yeah, I mean, it is essentially this sort of nationalist thing that somehow, I should care more about somebody because they're from within the same fairly arbitrary territory, if you like.
It does tend to set people against each other a lot, which I suspect is part of what governments want. If we're fighting one another, then it's much easier to rule the roost.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they never even begin to highlight the fact that there are skilled workers doing a great job, particularly working in the likes of the NHS and as nurses and stuff. They are just demonising them as pinching all of our jobs and at the same time pinching our benefits somehow.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know how many of our listeners have had much experience with job seekers, but it's a nightmare trying to get on job seekers, even if you are born in this country. I've had to give them all sorts of passports and P45s, and you can't do it if you're an immigrant. I'm sorry, you can't. It's hard work.
I mean, the thing with the nurses is interesting, because I don't know if you've seen this thing recently, this latest pile of shit from the governments, that they want to bring in this thing with non-EU migrants where basically they've got 5 years and they're not earning, I think it's over 35k a year within that time, then they'll be deported. I mean, essentially what it's doing is basically saying, again, we're fine with the middle class immigrants.
Expats.
This is something that's quite possibly going to cause real chaos. I mean, besides the fact that it's just fucking disgusting that people are being treated this way. 'Cause, I mean, I think it's easy to forget, and the press in particular like to forget or pretend to forget that this is real people, this is human beings here. It's not some abstract force that's coming here to steal jobs and all this bullshit.
Yeah, so there's something horribly wrong with wanting a much better life than what you're getting.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, as if somehow being British entitles you to more. It's such bollocks.
Well,
But yeah, I mean, but besides all that, it is going to sort of create real problems for the NHS because so many nurses come from overseas and come from outside of the EU, and well, I mean, how many nurses earn over 35k a year? Not many.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, it effectively means that, say, somebody could be working here as a nurse for 5 years, and it's expensive to recruit and to train a new nurse, even if they're already qualified. So sort of,
well, yeah, there'll be
yeah,
specific duties to carry out which are different in different states or different countries.
exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So basically, what it means is that just in terms of, yeah, it's going to be a complete nightmare within the NHS, and I can't help but think that that's. I'm not necessarily going to say something deliberate, but something that that the government aren't too bothered about, because the worse the NHS is, the easier it is to justify privatising things, and I think that that's a big part of that.
Another point that I wanted to bring up is that they're always harking on about immigrants, how they should be, taught English before getting here, and it's just like, I think to myself that as an EU member and as somebody within the European Union, I can personally go work anywhere within Europe, but I don't think the British people do, and I think that the reason for that is that we're not taught languages terribly well at school, and I think that's the one thing that discourages from working in wealthier parts of Europe than ourselves. I mean, there's nothing stopping us from working in Germany or France, anywhere really, wealthier parts of the EU.
I mean, I don't have the figures to hand, but I mean, there is a sizable number of British people who live in other EU countries or who work in other EU countries. Like the construction industry, I think, is quite a big one. I mean, it happens all over the place. It happens, from country to country. That a lot of the time, construction workers will be going to other countries for work, even on just a temporary basis, which is.
Yeah,
It's just an astonishing degree of hypocrisy, I think, from a lot of people.
I think a lot of it boils down to people's general ignorance, which, of course, guilty of myself to some degree. And I do feel sorry for Greece. I think they are in a horrible situation. But as much as I do feel sorry for the people, they are in a horrible situation, and the economy's essentially crumbling. The government still wants into the EU. I think. I don't even know where to begin to try and resolve that one. I think the IMF needs to calm down on how much they're demanding from them. I think that's the only way anything like that's going to be resolved. But
yeah, I mean, I think maybe this is one of these things where you and I have a somewhat different perspective, because I think that what the IMF needs is for all of them to be hung by their feet from lampposts, and then we can play football with their heads. And it'll be a great time. Join in, it'll be fun.
Well, on the other hand, if they do default on it, there's no one's going to lend Greece money ever again. So long term, I don't think they can do without.
Yeah,
and you do need to lend money in order for a country to function realistically.
Well,
I think.
I mean, I think that's a feature of the economy as it exists today. And it's one of the reasons why I don't think that. I mean, you see this with a lot of this stuff about vote Labour and Jeremy Corbyn superstar. He's going to walk across a lake and revive the corpse of Keynes from the dead, and it completely fails to take into account that states do depend on sort of having a stable economy that they have control over, and the structure of the modern economy is such that states depend on lending money. But I mean, I'd say that's more of a reason why we can't depend on the state to defend us from capital, really.
No, as I say,
I mean, again, I think it's maybe just different perspective between the two of us.
I do have the greatest sympathy for the people in Greece, because they're not in a good situation at all. But I do find it interesting that, despite everything, that even the more sort of left-wing government that they've got in still seems to want in, which I find interesting. I would just like to say that none of my opinions have been coloured in any way by EU colouring in books.
So, I recently saw a story, it was on the BBC website, about trading standards tackling a conference by the Genesis 2 Church. I'm not sure if you've heard of them.
I've not.
There's sort of a pseudo-religion that's basically all exists around this thing called miracle mineral solution or master mineral solution or any number of names, all of which are MMS.
As opposed to those real religions. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what I mean by that
I know
is
what you mean. Sorry.
it exists purely to give a shield to this sort of this thing that they're
Yeah.
running. I mean,
There's being like religiously honest and religiously trying to get money out of people.
yeah. So MMS is a quack remedy, which is essentially a form of industrial bleach, which they're sort of telling people to drink and to give themselves enemas with.
I've
Pretty
heard
nasty
of something
stuff.
like this. I didn't.
Yeah.
I think it was for curing something else, but I have heard of this.
Yeah, it's chlorine dioxide,
Cool.
and it's pretty nasty stuff. But yeah, they've touted it as a cure for cancer, for AIDS, for basically for anything. You know, anything is they say, oh yeah, MMS will cure you, which funnily enough is the thing that they sell a lot of books about. But I mean, the one that particularly sort of struck me, and I think they're taking advantage of a lot of vulnerable people. But I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me in particular is that they have a lot of focus on autistic people, and particularly on autistic children. And I mean, it's pretty disturbing, really, because who they're really marketing to there is parents of autistic children who, for whatever reason, and this is something I'm going to go into in a bit, basically can't accept that their child is autistic and are looking for a cure. And they're subjecting them to dangerous and frankly abusive, unevidenced remedies. And I mean that can do a lot of serious harm. I mean, in terms of the remedies themselves, and in terms of this idea that autism is a kind of sickness.
I mean,
if you know what I mean.
I'd like to say, like in this country, you'd think like if it actually worked, it would be on the NHS, but that's not exactly a great yardstick for it because they've got like homeopathic remedies on there. I mean, it should be a great way of saying, well, why aren't these guys funding it then?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's not.
Yeah. I mean, I'd sort of heard of this autism biomed thing before, a sort of hot mess of quackery and child abuse. But I'd always thought that it was sort of largely confined to the US. And when I saw this stuff about MMS being sort of peddled in the UK, I decided to sort of look into it a little bit more. And the first organisation I came across just by googling Autism Biomed UK was actually a registered charity called Treating Autism.
Oh dear.
It didn't take me long to find all kinds of bullshit on their site, more than I could possibly have time to go into here. I mean, their beginner's guide to treating autism promotes the idea that autism is caused by thimerosal in vaccines, which we know that there's no link between vaccines and autism, and there's no thimerosal in most vaccines these days anyway. It's complete nonsense.
It's funny how they keep getting rid of stuff and they keep still spouting the same shite. It must be the vaccines somehow.
Yeah, it's almost as if it has fuck all to do with vaccines.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Yeah, I mean they've got plenty of other things that they think will cause autism. Aspartame or aspartame, depending on where you're from. MSG, fluoride in toothpaste, fluoride in water. Heavy metals in fillings, paint, playground wood chips, and presumably hiding under your child's bed waiting to strike.
Sorry to interrupt. There are areas, I think, in India that have high levels of fluoride in their water. It does cause problems, but they don't have any high percentages of autism at all. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean this is one of the things that often comes up with a lot of the water fluoridation stuff, and yeah, I think those areas where that's been sort of looked into and studied, that you're talking about much higher concentrations of fluoride than get put into water supplies here. Basically, all of this stuff is nonsense. It has nothing to do with autism. Like, I mean, there's no credible evidence at all that fluoride in toothpaste will cause autism in your child. But I mean, again, what's more worrying is some of the treatments, so-called, that treating autism are promoting. So, for instance, the thing about heavy metals in fillings and paints and etc. etc. This is something that's quite common within the autism biomed community. This idea that autism is actually a form of heavy metal poisoning, and the solution to this that they propose a lot of the time is something called chelation. Chelation is a real treatment for heavy metal poisoning. It's often used legitimately by medical professionals for individuals with known high exposures to substances like mercury, lead and arsenic. It's unfortunately been appropriated by these quacks as a remedy for a range of conditions that we have no evidence is at all linked to heavy metal poisoning. And it's not without risks either, especially when it's performed using non-standard drugs by some unqualified person calling themselves a naturopath or a nutritionist or a toothologist or whatever term is fashionable lately.
And when they're bold enough to actually call themselves a flat-out doctor until proved otherwise.
Yeah. So one of the side effects, especially when it's not done properly, can be liver damage, kidney damage, really serious harm. And again, we're talking about vulnerable children here who have not really been given a choice about this. This is something that their parents and whoever's hoodwinked their parents is sort of forcing them into, effectively.
It's hard enough to treat kids with autism as it is. I mean, they're not going to tell you what part's hurting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that would vary, obviously, from individual to individual.
Sorry, I'm generalising.
But, yeah, I mean, another one that they seem quite keen on promoting is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Again, this is, in the right context, a legitimate medical treatment. It's exposing somebody to a high-pressure, high-oxygen environment. It's used to treat divers with the bends or people with really severe acute carbon monoxide poisoning. So, I mean, again, like chelation, it's sort of been appropriated by the woo crowd to treat things like autism, despite the fact that there is no evidence at all that it could possibly treat that sort of thing. The American Food and Drug Administration has quite a good guide to this stuff, and they point out that the more serious risks of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, especially when not done by competent medical professionals, can include paralysis, can include air embolism, and an air embolism, it's air in the veins that can be fatal.
Yeah, you from what I understand, you actually need quite a bit of that too. It's not like a tiny bubble in a needle. I mean, you can get away with that. I've seen it done. Nurses don't panic or anything. They're just like, yeah, it's too small to. So you do need quite a bit in your blood supply before it becomes an issue.
The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE as they're known, have released guidance on autism, and they clearly state in that both chelation and hyperbaric oxygen therapy should not be used as a treatment for autism under any circumstances or for vulnerable children in general. Unfortunately, despite this fairly sensible stance, NICE have decided to list treating autism as a supporting organisation on their website. So I contacted NICE about this via email, and if anybody else wants to do so, they can email them nice@nice.org.uk. Not that I'm encouraging people to pester them or anything. I would never do such a thing. They responded that essentially any organisation can be listed on the NICE website as a supporting organisation if they agree to promote NICE guidance. I mean, it sounds to me like it's a rubber stamp, basically.
Yeah.
And that's quite worrying if they're not monitoring it properly. And organisations like Treating Autism, who promote treatments that NICE guidance correctly states can be extremely harmful, are slipping through the net and are gaining legitimacy through this. I mean, I was quite disturbed to see that Treating Autism have recently received a big grant from the National Lottery. I mean, this is funding and support that could be going to organisations that actually do some good.
Yeah, anything else.
Yeah. So, Treating Autism aren't the only organisation like this. They're just sort of the first one that I came across. And there are a lot of concerns here that I don't have time to go into right now. So I'm going to be following this up both in later episodes of the show and away from the show. But in some ways I think that the real issue is this idea that autism needs to be treated at all. I mean, most organisations that are run by and for autistic people see that very idea as ableist, and I mean, I'd agree with them. This idea that autism is a sickness, that autistic people are broken or lost. And you often see it in woo circles when they're talking about autism. And often when they're talking about autistic children, anti-vax warrior mother extraordinaire Jenny McCarthy, who you might have heard of, she was on camera saying that the soul went out of her child's eyes when he was vaccinated in front of the child. A member of the board of the US Autism Speaks charity, which is another bullshit charity looking for a cure, talked openly again on film about committing murder-suicide of her autistic child in front of the child. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you just never do.
No.
I mean, this is a child. They're basically just assuming that the child can't understand them and talking about their own children in the most awful and dehumanising way. I think it really sums up sort of the mentality behind a lot of this autism cure shit. And a lot of the time, autistic people who are actually able to speak for themselves just get written off by these organisations. They won't speak to them, they won't acknowledge them, because it's much easier to peddle whatever bullshit you want if you don't deal with people who can answer back.
Well, yeah, they're just failing to address from the sound of things.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying here is that when we treat autism, which is effectively a different way of thinking and seeing the world, as a sickness, then we are attacking autistic people. I mean, many of whom would see their autism as sort of an essential part of their identity. So, I mean, instead of sort of allowing these quacks to encourage parents to denigrate their own children, expose them to dangerous snake oil, we should be asking how we can support families who are struggling and how we can work in solidarity with the autistic community to remove barriers that turn autism from a developmental difference into a disability.
Fortunately, they're making never more cutbacks on such things.
Yeah, well,
you'd think that David Cameron having a disabled child, you'd think he'd be more sensitive to such a thing, but no,
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose the difference there is that there was never any prospect of David Cameron's child going without anything.
No.
I mean, there are actually groups of disabled people specifically about fighting against the cuts. I mean, there's Black Triangle, who are really good. There's Disabled People Against the Cuts, who were in the news just earlier today, storming the Houses of Commons, because they are fucking awesome.
Which the BBC won't even touch on, I bet.
Well, they have an article on their website, but it's sort of, this happened, and then the nice policeman told us that we had to stop recording, so we stopped recording. Some brave fucking journalism there. So
yeah, I wanted to take a little bit of a time to talk about John Nash. He was a mathematician that died recently in a tragic traffic accident in New Jersey with his wife Felicia Nash back on May 23rd, 2015. If you're wondering where you might have heard the name John Nash, they made a film a few years ago with Russell Crowe, which from what I've looked into isn't terribly accurate.
Yeah, it's a gigantic pile of bollocks.
I think they did get some parts right, but they did also try to make him out to be like this poor, misunderstood, nice guy, really. But there are things I really do respect about the guy, and the things that I really don't. I couldn't possibly justify him. He was made famous not just by the film, but for winning a Nobel Prize in something called game theory, which John has, I'm sure, a few things to say about. He was a mathematician that did suffer early on in his career from schizophrenia, but one of the more impressive things I found out about him is that he was able to work on his mathematics with and without his meds, which isn't recommended if you do suffer from schizophrenia. But he was, oddly enough, one of the people that could manage to function without using his meds, which I do find fairly impressive. So I'm kind of curious, what is it about? Can you go into game theory a little bit more? Because I don't even pretend to understand.
It's something that's sort of not exactly my field. I mean, I study maths, as you know. It's essentially the study of conflict and competition, sort of. So I mean, like you have sort of the classic ones like the prisoner's dilemma, where you have this idea of two prisoners who are both being interviewed for a crime that they collaborated on. And the classic prisoner's dilemma is set up in such a way that they each will get less prison time if they, it's referred to as defect, if they basically rat out the other guy. Yeah. The prisoner's dilemma, as it's classically conceived, is a zero-sum game. Whatever you get out of it is a loss for the other guy.
One of the examples that's used in the film Beautiful Mind, and you can pick this apart as much as you like, is that there's a really, really attractive woman at a bar, and there's like 4 or 5 blokes, and she's got some friends, and he tries to persuade them that it's not a good idea at all going for the pretty girl because you essentially just cockblock one another. It's better to ignore them and go off. But the other aspect is that the first one to betray, has a greater chance essentially.
Yeah, I mean
it's coming to some sort of agreement and then stabbing someone in the back, from what I can understand.
Well, not exactly. The key insight, which is actually named after him, is the Nash equilibrium, which is a situation in a competitive situation where neither party has any incentive to change strategy. I mean, effectively, you assume that your opponent will always attempt to get the best out of the situation, and so will you. So that you choose a strategy where they have no incentive to pick something that will result in a worse result for you. That particular analogy, I'm not entirely sure whether it originated with Nash or...
He didn't come up with game theory as such. He added to it.
The bar analogy thing.
Ah, right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure whether that originated with Nash, and I think there's a lot of things you could say about it. I mean, particularly do the women in this situation not get a choice about it? I think would be the first thing that I would pick up on there. And do we assume that everybody has the same standard?
I think it was
what
used
they're
as an
attracted
example.
to. Oh, it's an example, I'm aware, but it's a pretty fucking sexist example, you have to admit.
Yeah, I think I was saying, getting us off the film.
I know it's just coming from the film.
Another version I've heard of it then is the smoking thing. So if all the smoking companies were to make an agreement to not waste money on advertisements, then they'd do quite well out of it because they'd sell just the same anyway. They're not competing against each other. But because the smoking ban on adverts means that all of them are now saving money. Mm-hmm. There's no option to try and screw over the opposite company. They are all winning out because of it. In fact, they are actually making more money because they've stopped them advertising. There's no way for them to compete against each other.
Mm.
That's been used as an example. But
well, one of the things with a lot of game theory is it's this thing of it makes a lot of sense as a way of modelling competition, and particularly situations where neither party has any particular incentive to cooperate with each other. It is an interesting field.
Isn't it border on psychology to some degree? Because there's people with upper hands in it that like a game of poker will...
I think generally speaking, when you get into sort of real life situations, a lot of this stuff sort of falls apart a little bit. I mean, in your sort of classic game theory scenario, the kind of thing looked at by John Nash, you essentially assume that your opponent will always make the best possible move in response to whatever you do.
Mm.
I mean, that's what's sort of called min-maxing. So you look at each of your strategies and you say, well, if I do this, my opponent's best possible move would be this. If I do this, my opponent's best possible move would be this. And so you sort of say, okay, so what's the worst thing that can happen from each of these strategies? And you choose the least worst on the assumption that your opponent will choose the best thing for themselves. When both parties are doing that, a lot of the time it will settle into this Nash equilibrium. There are situations where it doesn't, but that's sort of getting into something quite complicated and quite difficult to do over audio.
I did spend a little bit of time looking into like the psychiatric treatment that he got. I can understand his sort of fear and cynicism about authoritative sort of figures. I mean, the first psychiatric hospital he was able to get himself out of by talking to certain lawyers, and it was the first time round. I don't think too many people understood what he was actually going through. But the second time he was actually sectioned, one of the things they did, which I think was rather cruel, was put people into insulin comas. And what that involves is giving you an overdose of insulin, so you essentially pass out for 1/2 the day. In other words, the people that were looking after him were just basically knocking him out for a good portion of the day. Every time I look into psychiatric hospitals back when, it just horrifies me.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty dark history there. And the sort of the history of psychiatry right up until sort of like the 70s and 80s in a lot of ways. And I mean, it's not brilliant now, but it was just so much of it is just so horrific.
Imagine if you were suffering from such a thing, and then you've already gone through that ordeal. No wonder you wouldn't want to seek help. His wife actually made him a promise that she wouldn't have him sectioned again, which is I think part of the reason why he did end up stabilising a bit.
I mean, it is a difficult one in general. I think. I mean, this sort of thing of people being sectioned, and it can be a horrific experience, and a lot of that comes down to just how shitty mental health care can be.
I've only ever spoken to a few people, like possibly two in my entire life, that have been sectioned, and I've never heard them saying, "Oh, you know, it really helped," and never. Not that I'm saying that like it's ultimately bad, but I've not heard great things even in today's circumstances. I've heard of people volunteering themselves into it, and because of a mistranslation, they were like basically jumped on and had pills forced down their throat, or because somebody said what and they didn't quite hear them. Another thing about John Nash is that apparently when he was much younger, he was seeing a woman for a little while that became pregnant with his child. When she did eventually have the child, he completely abandoned them to the point where she actually had to give up her son for adoption, which, you know, I was like, the film portrays him as some sort of misunderstood character, and he was far from it. I know it's not particularly nice about talking bad about the dead or whatever, but, you know, this is something he did do.
Yeah, I think there is a tendency to whitewash people, and particularly, particularly to be honest, if you're making a Hollywood film about somebody, I think a lot of that comes down to sort of lazy writers. Yeah, it's much easier to do a sympathetic character if you never show them do anything wrong.
Yeah. Well, even his colleagues were saying that he was a very sort of arrogant, very clever man, but very difficult to work with. But they're saying he was actually easier to work with once he did come back from, you know, psychiatric hospitals and stuff. Once he was on his meds, he was actually easy to work with, believe it or not. He did do work both on and off his meds. One of the things that he did manage to do was work on fluid dynamics, which I know zero about. Is it something you may?
I've not done anything on fluid dynamics.
Sorry, I'm picking on Sean because he's got a mathematics background, so it's only fair.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that I think it involves calculus somehow. A lot of things do. That's not something I know anything about, really. The more you study this kind of stuff, the more you realise that there are whole areas that you should just really not talk about.
Well, I know truly less than nothing. I know my times tables and it's about that. Although, don't you dare test me on it. Yeah, so this is a man that, like, I do respect, but I do have a hard time liking. He did pass away at a sort of reasonable age, despite it being tragic. He did die at the age of 86. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but...
Oh, I mean, it's a good innings, isn't it?
Yeah, all things considered. That's a average in the Western world, isn't it? Or is it slightly higher?
I think that's higher than average, possibly. I'm not too sure. I mean, it's like Christopher Lee died recently. I mean, that was what was he, 93?
He was in his 90s, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things. Well, obviously, it's a sad thing when anybody dies.
Yeah.
And there's never a good time for somebody to die.
The nicest thing I can say is that he was a fascinating bloke, without a doubt. I'm sure there'll be some other film coming out, probably not too far from now, because films get made when people die.
Hopefully starring somebody other than Russell Crowe. Maybe they'll find an actor. Workfare is fairly well known, but for anybody who doesn't know much about it, it's a range of different schemes where people on benefits are required to work without being paid real wages under threat of being sanctioned and losing their benefits. I mean, there's a few different schemes. There's the likes of mandatory work activity, which is 4 weeks unpaid work for up to 30 hours a week. There's the work programme. This is something that you'd normally put on about 9 to 12 months after first signing on to job seekers. I mean, this is where you're sent to some company like A4E or Ingeus, and they will basically send you out on Workfare placements. Ingeus, who are one of the sort of biggest Workfare companies, apparently have been forcing people to do 6-month-long Workfare placements. So,
how are you supposed to find a real job in that time?
Yeah. Funnily enough, it was 2012, the DWP published the results of a study that they did themselves of one of their Workfare schemes, which is the Community Action Programme, and that was like a 6-month-long Workfare placement. And what came out of that was that people who'd been on the scheme tended to come off the dole at about the same rate as people who hadn't been on the scheme, funnily enough. I mean, so Workfare, this can be for charities or for for-profit companies, even sort of major corporations like the Tesco and Asda.
I think, personally, if I was forced into doing it with Tesco, I'd be accidentally getting in the way and accidentally, on purpose, breaking stuff.
Did I drop the 20th jar of the day?
Yeah, don't be of any help. Be an absolute hindrance. Of course, I'm not telling anyone to do this.
Yeah, claimants on these Workfare schemes are being forced to work for the profit of an organisation, despite the fact that the organisation isn't paying them a penny. So, I mean, in addition to being effectively forced unpaid labour, Workfare puts downward pressure on wages and leads to less hours being available for paid work.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you give companies the opportunity to take on staff for free, if you give them that opportunity for free labour, then why should they pay somebody to do it? That would be. I mean, we're sort of maybe coming back to sort of game theory and being incredibly cynical here, but what possible incentive do they have to pay people for work if they can get it done for free? I mean, who would do that?
Mm.
There's been a campaign going against Workfare for quite some time, since way back when we last had a Labour government, and in case we forget, they were introducing Workfare schemes.
I haven't had much of it, to be honest, and I mistakenly thought it had all died down. I thought like Tesco's and who were the other companies? Was it?
Oh, there were loads.
There were quite a few. I know one. They kept pulling out one by one, didn't they? From what I understand, but.
Yeah, well,
I mean, did they? Or?
I mean, some companies did pull out. Tesco said they were going to pull out and then didn't. The Holland and Barrett and Pizza Hut, I think, were two which pulled out after sort of long campaigns of sort of direct action and protest at their stores. And I mean, that's something that a lot of campaigners, particularly from Solidarity Federation and from the sort of campaigning group Boycott Workfare, organised quite a lot of that, and there was some success with that. And I mean, I think that's something that, as this happens more and more companies sort of pull out, it makes the scheme less and less workable.
Yeah, I know they probably shouldn't pat the ones on the back for pulling out, because they shouldn't have done it in the first place, but the more you highlight the ones that you have pulled out, it does make the ones that you're still doing it look terrible.
Yeah, well, I mean, recently on Merseyside, there's a company, Bulky Bob's, which anybody from outside of Liverpool probably won't have heard of. I'm not sure if you.
I've not heard of them.
I mean, they're a waste disposal company. You call them and they come and pick up your old mattresses and your furniture and things like that. I mean, they get some funding from the council for doing this, and then they do the stuff up and they sell it on for cheap. Yeah, so I mean, it came out, and this was about a year ago, I think. It came out that they were going to be using Workfare, and Liverpool IWW announced our intentions to hold a protest about this, and were contacted by Bulky Bob's almost immediately saying that they would pull out, and they then agreed to launch a joint statement with us condemning Workfare. I mean, I think it was kind of like a hell of a success, considering that and all that it took was sort of the threat of action.
I'd like to think that some companies out there, or the managers out there, are just they haven't thought it through, and it sometimes it just takes a bit of highlighting for them to wake up a bit. I'm being generous to them, but I like to think that way.
So this Saturday coming, 27th of June, there's actually a national day of action been called by Boycott Workfare, and that's going to be targeting B&M bargains. They are a massive company, B&M. I think I saw on the Boycott Workfare website they've made about 100 million over the last year, and so they can fucking well pay people wages.
Yeah.
And not only are they using Workfare, they were recently given an award for how brilliant they are at running Workfare schemes. So, I mean, this is why they're being targeted in particular this Saturday. There's going to be protests at B&M stores up and down the country. On Merseyside, there's actually two going to be happening. There's one at the B&M store on Park Road in Toxteth, and another at the B&M store on Clawton Street in Birkenhead. I think both of those are around midday, and you can look them up on Facebook. So there's also going to be sort of going after B&M on social media as well. So if there isn't a protest near you and you're not able to organise one, or or if you just can't get out and about for whatever reason, you can also take part via Twitter and via Facebook, basically just by going on there and letting B&M know, demanding that they stop exploiting people by using Workfare. I think that's all we've got time for today. We've actually got Twitter and an email now.
Sort of.
Yeah. So if you want to if you want to get in touch with us and tell us how fucking wrong we are about everything, then you can find us on Twitter at PolGeekery, and you can reach us via email politicalgeekery@gmail.com. So I've been Sean.
I'm Mark.
Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Ta-ra.